Hello, I'm Claudia, and today is February 11th, 2023. Today we will be talking about sensory receptors. Just want to make sure that the presentation is on. But anyways, today we'll be talking about sensory receptors and their connection to the central nervous system. And before we get into this, we first should establish exactly what is a sensory receptor. And sensory receptors relate to our senses. It relates to sight, touch, smell, taste, and hearing, but also relates to other things such as our autonomic nervous system, and we'll see examples of this later. Sensory receptors can take the form of free nerve endings, encapsulated nerve endings, or specialized receptor cells. A sensory receptor converts a stimulus into electronic potential, and if the stimulus is strong and above the threshold, then action potentials can generate signals to the central nervous system. From there, they can go through the cerebral cortex, and one can consciously perceive them. Or we can get them subconsciously, as mentioned before. And here on the bottom right is sort of a depiction of what I mentioned about stimulus. If there's a weak stimulus, then you can see the pathway in which there's a weak receptor potential, there's few action potentials generated, and little to no signals sent to the brain. But if there's a large stimulus, a strong stimulus that is above the threshold, then depolarization occurs, strong receptor potential is seen, there's a lot of action potentials, and a lot of signals are sent to the brain, and something happens. And there are four main types of sensory receptors. The first would be chemoreceptors, which relate to taste and smell, mechanoreceptors, which relate to pressure and sound. We have thermoreceptors, which relate to temperature, and photoreceptors, which relate to vision and light. Also to mention, mechanoreceptors have among other things such more than pressure and sound. And we'll talk more about that later. And we're going to get into all of these types of sensory receptors. And first we'll start off with chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors relate to respiratory actions, taste, and smell. And examples of stimuli include oxygen, pH, and molecules such as glucose and sodium. It's kind of the name, but chemoreceptors respond to chemical molecules that would bind to the receptor. Chemoreceptors also monitor our breathing in order to maintain homeostasis, and there are chemoreceptors located in the medulla, which is part of the central nervous system. These sensory receptors are sensitive to changes to levels of CO2, otherwise known as carbon dioxide, and high levels of carbon dioxide in the body bring about more hydrogen ions, and when this happens, pH is lowered, and the body doesn't like that. So this triggers chemoreceptors to send messages to the brain to increase breathing out carbon dioxide, and this would bring pH back to homeostatic levels. The same concept applies to oxygen. When there's a lack of oxygen in the body, it induces chemoreceptors to send stimulus to the brain to induce the body to breathe more oxygen in. Additionally, as mentioned before, chemoreceptors relate to our ability to taste and smell. And the picture on the bottom right is from the textbook, and I thought it was a good depiction of the process in which chemoreceptors work, kind of, and then how we perceive taste. And the first step is when the ligand binds to the GPCR receptor, chemoreceptor, and the ligand could be glucose or sodium molecules that bind to the GPCR, which then induces signal transduction to occur. And following that, calcium signals in the cytoplasm trigger exocytosis or ATP production, and this then leads neurotransmitters to be released. And finally, primary sensory neurons fire the action potential, and this information is sent to the brain, which allows us to perceive if something's sweet or bitter or salty. And I thought it's really interesting here where they have a table that lists the types of taste: sweet, umami, bitter, and the GPCR family that they belong to. Next, we have mechanoreceptors, and mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical energy. Examples of stimuli for mechanoreceptors include pressure, cell stretch, and this was in the first image that I showed you with the different levels of stimulus. I'll go back and indicate it again. But on the bottom right is basically a mechanoreceptor process with cell stretch. Anyways, there's also vibration, sound, and acceleration as examples of stimuli. And to the right is an image of an example of how sound goes through the sensory pathway. Here, sound waves enter the ear, and then they're converted into neural signals by means of mechanoreceptors, and in this case, they're hair cells in the air that amplify the sound vibrations, which excite the nerve fibers, and then, like chemoreceptors, signal transduction occurs, and signals are sent to the auditory cortex where they can recognize this information and process sound. An example of this would be you hearing a melody in the background or sounds in the background, and signals are fired to your brain, and it causes us to recognize that the sounds that we're hearing sound like this popular lullaby that we're used to hearing as a child. It allows us to recognize particular things in sound and recognize music, for example. Next, we have photoreceptors, and photoreceptors indicates light energy that is converted into electronical signals. Photoreceptors are sensory receptors that allow us to see and perceive light. Light is reflected from objects in our environment, and it translates to a mental image that makes up our vision. The process is again relatively simple. Light enters the eye, and the light goes to the back of the eye where it reaches the retina, and our retina's photoreceptors convert light into electrical signals, and our brain processes these signals into an image through electrical signals that move throughout the central nervous system. Our retina has two types of photoreceptors, so I decided to include this image on the right to better visualize. We have cones and rods as photoreceptors, and rods let us see in dark light, so that's why you're able to get up in the middle of the night and make your way out the door and into the bathroom. Like, you're able to see thanks to rods. And cones allow us to see in daylight with color. And once light gets to these photoreceptors, signals are sent to bipolar cells, which send signals to the ganglion cells depicted on the right. And when they leave the retina, when these signals leave the retina, it gets to the optic nerve, where information is sent to the brain to be processed to allow us to see these visual images. And lastly, we have thermoreceptors. And on the skin, thermoreceptors take the form of free nerve endings. But thermoreceptors are found everywhere in the body, including the central nervous system, because one of the main functions of the body is to maintain temperate homeostasis. And we have cold and warm thermoreceptors to serve as sensory receptors to heat and cold. Thermoreceptors have a close relationship with the autonomic nervous system, and the role of thermoreceptors is to monitor skin and core body temperature, and then to send that information to the thermoregulatory center. The hypothalamic thermoregulatory center of the central nervous system then goes and compares the information to our desired body set point to induce the right physiological response. And the diagram on the right does a good job in demonstrating this concept. And I'll explain it here. There's a boy, say he's running late to class. So the stimulus is he's had a lot of physical activity, which makes a lot of heat build up in his body. So thermoreceptors detect this increase in our body temperature, and it indicates that there's a problem with our homeostatic temperature levels. So it sends these signals to our control center, which is our hypothalamus, and our hypothalamus decides to activate mechanisms to increase heat loss and allow us to cool down. And an example of this would be sweating. Sweating causes our body to cool down. And keep in mind that this is an involuntary action. Then the body gets back to a set point, and thermoreceptors tell the hypothalamus to stop the work of sweat glands. All in all, these sensory neurons have similar pathways and all require a stimulus in order for action potentials and electrical signals to be sent to the central nervous system, where perceptions and actions can be induced. And on the last slide, I have references with some pictures and websites in the textbook that I had used for this presentation. And yeah, thank you for listening to my presentation.